On the third Friday of March 1969 in Cass County, Nebraska, a 26-year-old cattle farmer named Calvin Reed sat in the back row of the Plattsmouth Livestock Barn with $110 in his shirt pocket and a plan that nobody in that building would have believed if he told them. He did not tell them. The barn smelled the way it always did in early spring hay and manure and the sharp edge of cold air that had not yet decided to become warm. Farmers from 3 counties had come out that morning, the kind of men who wore the same canvas jacket every day from October to April, and knew the weight of a calf by looking at it from 20 feet away. The folding chairs filled up fast. Calvin found a seat near the back wall away from the main crowd and settled in to watch. He had been watching livestock auctions since he was 9 years old, standing beside his father Harold in this same building, learning the difference between a bid and a bluff. Harold Reed had taught his son to sit still and pay attention before he taught him anything else about farming. Sit still, pay attention. The man who moves first usually loses. Calvin sat still. He paid attention. The morning moved through its lots in the way these things always do, Hereford bulls with wide necks and solid hindquarters, selling between $300 and $500 a string of black Angus cows that drew serious interest from a buyer out of Lincoln, some dairy animals that moved slower. Calvin watched the prices noted, which bloodlines drew the most hands, and waited. Lot 34 came into the ring at 11:17 in the morning. The animal was unlike anything else that had sold that day. Where the Herefords were deep red and white, blocky and familiar, this bull was pale, the color of old cream, almost white with faint gray dappling across his shoulders. He was tall for his age, long in the body, narrow in the head, with hip bones that showed clearly beneath the pale hide. His ribs were visible. He moved quietly into the ring without the pulling and snorting the Hereford bulls had shown, just walked in, and stood there looking at the crowd with large dark eyes that did not seem particularly troubled by any of it. The auctioneer glanced down at his sheet, then back at the animal, and something in his voice shifted just slightly, the tone a man uses when he already knows the answer is going to be slow. Lot 34, gentlemen. Young bull, 20 months breed, listed as he paused, Simmental. That's a European breed, Swiss origin for those not familiar. We'll open the bidding at $150. Silence. 150, gentlemen. Breeding age bull. Do I have 150? Nothing moved. All right, 100. Who'll give me 100? The man sitting 2 rows in front of Calvin turned around to look at who might raise a hand. He found no one. Calvin raised his. $85. The auctioneer blinked. Sir, the opening was 100. Calvin kept his hand up. $85, he said again, quiet and even. The auctioneer looked at him for a moment, looked at the bull, looked back at Calvin. 85. I have 85. Do I hear 90? That was when Harlan Speck stood up. Let me tell you about Harlan Speck, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Harlan had run the John Deere dealership in Plattsmouth for 19 years, having married into it when he was 29. He was 48 now, thick through the chest and thicker through the middle, with a red face that went redder when he laughed, which was often, and a voice loud enough to carry across a tractor lot in a January wind. He knew machinery. He genuinely knew it. He could talk horsepower and hydraulics for an hour without repeating himself, and the farmers in 3 counties respected him for it. The problem was that Harlan had made the mistake that some successful men make, which is to assume that because they know one thing well, they know everything else at a similar level. He had grown up on a cattle farm. He had left that life at 22. In the 26 years since farming had changed considerably, and Harlan had changed mainly in the direction of his waistline and the size of his opinions. He stood up, turned to face the room rather than the auctioneer, and spoke at a volume that made sure every person in the building could hear him. Calvin Reed. He shook his head with a broad smile, the kind of smile that invites others to join in. That animal looks like it already lost a bet. You better start digging that grave now while the ground's still soft, son, because it won't make it to June. He paused for the laughter, and it came. I'll tell you what I'll do for you, Calvin. I'll sell you a good sharp shovel at my cost price. Consider it a professional courtesy. The barn responded the way barns do when a loud man says something mean and frames it as friendly. Men chuckled. Somebody slapped a knee. Dale Fitch, who managed First Farmers Bank of Plattsmouth and had been sitting near Harlan since the sale started, leaned forward in his chair. Calvin, he said, if you want to light $85 on fire, you could at least get some warmth out of it. That thing, there's nothing but a vet bill with legs. More laughter. A farmer near the center called out that it looked like a dairy animal on a bad week. Another said maybe Calvin was planning to make cheese. Someone repeated Harlan's joke about the shovel because they hadn't heard it clearly the first time. Calvin Reed sat in the back of the Plattsmouth livestock barn, his bid number in his hand, and said nothing at all. He did not argue, he did not explain. He did not look around to see who was laughing or how many. He waited until the noise settled, and the auctioneer who had been letting it run, because these things are part of the business, finally brought his gavel down. $85. Going once, going twice. Sold. Calvin walked to the clerk's window, paid in cash, and led the pale bull out to his trailer. As he pulled out of the lot onto the county road, he could still hear Harlan Speck's voice through the truck window, carrying the way it always did. Dead by summer. You heard it here. Calvin drove north toward home with his hands steady on the wheel and a bull in the trailer that nobody in Cass County wanted, and he thought about a livestock magazine folded in the drawer of his father's old desk, and about a fairgrounds in Kansas City, and about the specific way a man's voice sounds when he is absolutely certain he is right. Let me tell you about Harold Reed because Calvin's father is where this story really starts. Harold had farmed the same 160 acres west of Plattsmouth his entire adult life, and he had done it the way his own father had done it before him, without debt. Not because Harold was opposed to banks on principle, though he was not fond of them, but because his father had taught him that the man who owed money was always farming for someone else, and Harold Reed intended to farm for himself until the day he couldn't anymore. He passed the land to Calvin in 1964, debt-free, and 2 months later, he was gone from a heart that had been wearing down quietly for years without announcing it. Calvin was 21 years old. He had 160 acres, 22 Hereford cows, a tractor that was old when his father bought it, and a wife named Dorothy, who everyone called Dot, who had grown up on a grain farm 12 miles east and understood what it meant to work without guarantees. They were not struggling, but they were not getting ahead. The Hereford operation ran the way Hereford operations ran across Nebraska in the late 1960s, predictable, modest, tied to a market that rewarded the kind of cattle everyone already knew. Calvin sold calves in the fall at prices that covered expenses and left something over, but not enough to grow on. He had been looking in the way that patient men look for something different. He just had not found it yet. He found it in Kansas City in the fall of 1967. Let me tell you about that trip because 2 days at the Missouri Valley Livestock Exposition changed everything Calvin Reed believed about what was possible on 160 acres in Nebraska. He drove down alone, slept in the truck, walked the fairgrounds for 2 days with $20 in his pocket. Most of what he saw was familiar. The same breeds, the same equipment dealers, the same conversations he could have had at any sale barn in a 5-county radius. On the afternoon of the second day, in a smaller exhibition building near the east end of the fairgrounds, he walked past a pen he almost didn't stop at. The cattle inside were unlike any breed he had seen. Pale, rangy, long-bodied animals with a musculature that sat differently than Hereford's, heavier through the hindquarters, lighter through the neck and shoulder. They looked to eyes trained on traditional American beef breeds almost wrong. Like something between a beef animal and a dairy animal, not quite either. There were 8 of them in the pen, and a man in a Canadian agricultural cooperative jacket standing beside them, handing out a printed sheet to anyone who slowed down. Most people did not slow down. Calvin stopped. The man's name was not important, but what he said was, "These are Simmental cattle, Swiss breed, been raised in Europe for 600 years, dual-purpose animals, beef and milk both. Now what matters for what you're doing is this." He pointed at the printed sheet. "Feed conversion, that's the number. Simmental convert feed to muscle more efficiently than any North American beef breed currently in commercial production. 1 pound of gain on roughly 5.5 to 6 pounds of feed against 7 to 7.5 for your Herefords." He paused to let that land. "You know what that means on a hay short year?" Calvin knew what it meant. The man continued. "Dress out percentage. 62 to 64% for a well-bred Simmental cross against 58 to 60 for Hereford. Means more saleable beef per hundredweight of live animal. Packers in Chicago are starting to pay a premium for it. And here's the thing that matters most right now. American Simmental Association was incorporated last year. There are fewer than 400 registered animals in the entire country. A proven bull with documented bloodlines sells for $3,500 to $6,000 where they exist. In 10 years, maybe 15 Simmental genetics will be throughout the American beef herd. The ranches that control the bloodlines now will be in a position nobody else can touch. Calvin drove home with the printed sheet 2 Simmental quarterlies the man gave him for free and something sitting quietly in his chest that was not excitement exactly, but was something close to it. He spent the next 18 months reading every article the American Simmental Association published. He wrote a letter to their office in Bozeman, Montana, and received back a 40-page technical report on breed performance data. He spoke to a veterinarian in Lincoln named Elbert Crane, who had actually examined Simmental cattle on a ranch in Saskatchewan and described their condition and conformation in terms that matched everything Calvin had read. Doc Crane was 63 years old and had practiced large animal medicine in Nebraska for 37 years. He was not an enthusiast by nature. He was the kind of man who said less than he knew, which Calvin respected. When Calvin showed him the performance data, Doc read through it carefully, set it down, and said, "The breed is everything they claim. The problem is that to American eyes, they look sick. Ribs showing pale color, long and lean instead of blocky. Anyone who judges a beef animal the way they learned to in Nebraska is going to laugh at a Simmental and think they're being smart." His voice was dry. "Most of them are going to be wrong for about a decade before they figure it out. If you can find one at a sale of Calvin, and if you have the patience, don't tell anyone what you're doing. Let them think you made a mistake." That was in October of 1968. 6 months later, Lot 34 came into the ring at the Plattsmouth Livestock Barn. Now let me tell you about the first morning Calvin brought Frost home, because that is what he named the bull, and because that morning contained the thing that would either make the next decade bearable or turn it into something else entirely. Dot was standing at the kitchen window when the trailer came up the lane. She came outside and looked through the slats at the pale animal standing quietly in the back, and she said what a woman who has been around livestock her whole life says when she sees something she cannot immediately categorize. "What kind of animal is that, Simmental?" "Swiss breed." She looked at him for a moment. "He looks thin, Calvin. He is thin. He's also 20 months old, and he spent the last 4 months in a sale yard eating low-grade hay. He'll change." Dot looked at the bull again with the expression she had learned to use when she was deciding whether to pursue a thing or let it go. How much Calvin told her. She was quiet. $85 could have been a new kitchen faucet and the part we need for the baler. She went back inside. She did not say anything else about the $85, which Calvin understood to mean that she was reserving judgment rather than accepting the decision. That was fair. He had not yet earned anything else. He put Frost in a separate pen on the east side of the barn, away from the Hereford cows. He spent the first evening just looking at the animal through the fence, the way his father used to do with a new piece of equipment, not touching, just watching. His father used to say that you could learn more about a machine or an animal by watching it do nothing for an hour than you could by poking at it for a week. Frost stood in the pen and ate steadily from the hay Calvin had put in, did not pace, did not balk, did not show any of the anxiety that a sales-stressed animal usually carried for the first few days. He just ate. His father's voice came back to Calvin then the way it had a habit of doing in the quiet moments. "A healthy animal eats right and sleeps quiet," Harold used to say. "Don't watch the color of the hide. Watch the way it eats." Frost ate like an animal that intended to be alive for a long time. Within 2 weeks, the neighbors started coming by. Vernon Holt stopped his truck at the fence line on a Thursday afternoon and leaned out the window with the expression of a man who has already formed his opinion and is now collecting evidence to support it. "Still kicking, I see." He nodded at Frost. "You know, my wife Loretta thought I was joking when I told her you paid $85 for that thing. I had to tell her twice." He shook his head with a kind of affectionate contempt that is particular to men who consider themselves helpful. "What are you feeding him, Calvin? He needs about 60 pounds of grain a day just to catch up to what a proper bull should look like." Calvin was replacing a board on the fence and did not look up. "He's eating what he needs, Vern." Harlan Speck was less subtle. He encountered Calvin at the feed store in Plattsmouth 3 weeks after the auction, standing at the counter while Calvin waited for a grain order, and said it loud enough for the 2 men behind the counter to hear. "I heard you're spending real money on feed for that pale thing you bought, Calvin." He shook his head with a performance of concern that did not quite reach his eyes. You know what you're doing. You're pouring water into a bucket with a hole in it. That animal's constitution isn't built for Nebraska winters. I've been around cattle my whole life. You want to know what that bull is? He's a vet bill. He's a burial. He's $85 you could have put towards something that was going to live. Calvin paid for his grain order and drove home. What neither Harlan Speck, nor Vernon Holt, nor Dale Fitch, nor anyone else in Cass County understood as the spring of 1969 turned into summer and frost grew steadily in his east side pen was that the question was never whether Calvin Reed had made a mistake. The question was whether the people laughing at him knew enough to know the difference between a mistake and a decision they simply didn't have the information to understand. Doc Crane had said it plainly, let them think you made a mistake. Calvin intended to. But the test of that intention was still ahead of him, and it was longer and harder than any single afternoon in an auction barn. It was going to be measured in years and setbacks, in seasons that did not cooperate, in mornings when the numbers did not add up and the laughter from town still carried. The Simmental breed was real. The performance data was accurate. What Calvin did not yet know, sitting on a fence rail in the March cold, watching frost settle into his new home, was exactly how much patience it was going to require before any of that mattered to anyone but himself. The sound of the auction barn was already fading. The work was just beginning. On the first morning after Frost spent a full season in the East Side pen, Calvin Reed walked out before sunrise with a flashlight and stood at the fence for 20 minutes without doing anything else. The bull was asleep on his feet the way healthy cattle sleep, weight shifted to 3 legs, head low, breathing slow and even in the cold air. His ribs were less visible than they had been in March. His hindquarters had begun to fill out in the particular way that Doc Crane had described, not the broad, blocky musculature of a Hereford, but something longer and deeper, a different architecture, entirely built for a different kind of work. Calvin went back inside and told Dot that Frost was going to be fine. She was making coffee at the stove. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I never thought he wasn't." That was the whole of the conversation, but Calvin understood what it meant. Dot Reed did not offer encouragement. She did not believe. If she said she had never doubted it, then she had never doubted it, and that was a more solid thing to stand on than anything else he had in the spring of 1970. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because they are the part of this story that is easiest to summarize and hardest to actually live through. The work of building a Simmental breeding program from a single bull and 22 Hereford cows on 160 acres in Cass County, Nebraska was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the same chores on the same land through the same seasons, with results that came slowly and setbacks that came faster, and a community that had moved on from laughing at Calvin Reed mainly because they had other things to talk about and would only remember to laugh again when something reminded them. The first thing Calvin had to decide was which Hereford cows to breed to Frost. He did not have the luxury of breeding all 22. Frost was young, and Calvin wanted to be careful about how hard he worked the bull in his first breeding season. He chose 4 cows, the ones with the best frames, the deepest bodies, the most consistent fertility records, and he put Frost with them in October of 1970 and waited. The calves came in January and February of 1971. 3 of the 4 cows settled. The calves were unlike anything Calvin had seen born on his property. They were pale the way Frost was pale, not the creamy white of their father exactly, but a washed-out tan that came from mixing Simmental white with Hereford red, and they were longer than Hereford calves, narrower in the head, with the same quality of stillness that Frost had shown from the beginning. They did not bawl and scramble the way new Hereford calves did. They got up, found their mothers, and went to work. Vernon Holt drove past in late February and stopped when he saw the calves in the pasture. He sat in his truck for a long moment before he got out and walked to the fence. Calvin was working nearby and watched him come. "What happened to your calves?" Calvin Vern's voice had lost some of its amusement from the year before. It had been replaced by something closer to genuine puzzlement. "They look wrong. I mean that sincerely. They look like something drained the color out of them. You got a disease moving through your cows." "They're healthy, Vern. They don't look healthy. What are you telling me?" "They look like calves that aren't sure what they are yet." Calvin kept working. "That makes 2 of us," he said, and he meant it as a joke, but Vern took it as confirmation of something he had suspected and drove away shaking his head. The real test came in October when Calvin loaded the 3 Simmental Cross calves alongside 6 of his Hereford calves and drove them to the sale barn at Nebraska City. He had not told anyone he was bringing the crosses. He had not advertised what they were. He just brought them and waited to see what a cattle buyer from outside Cass County would say when he looked at them. The buyer's name was Roy Patton. He worked for a packing operation out of Omaha, and he had been buying calves in southeastern Nebraska for 11 years. He walked the pens the way buyers do, moving quickly, not stopping long at anything until something made him stop. He stopped at Calvin's Simmental crosses. He looked at them for a while without saying anything. Then he crouched down and looked at the legs and the hindquarters and the depth of body. Then he stood up and found Calvin standing nearby. "These are Simmental Cross," he said. It was not a question. "That's right," Calvin said. "First ones I've seen at this market." Roy walked around them again. "Where did you get the sire Plattsmouth barn?" "Spring of '69. Roy looked at him. "What did you pay?" Calvin told him. Roy was quiet for a moment. He looked at the calves. Then he named a price that was $18 per hundredweight, above what the Hereford calves were bringing that day, and he said he would take all 3. Calvin nodded and said thank you and collected his check at the end of the day, and on the drive home, he did the arithmetic in his head. 3 Simmental Cross calves at a premium above market had returned more than the entire cost of purchasing and feeding Frost for his first year of ownership. The $85 investment had not paid off yet, not fully, but the direction was unmistakable. He did not tell anyone in Plattsmouth what Roy Patton had said. He went home, told Dot the number, and that night after supper, he sat at his father's old desk and made notes in the ledger he kept for the breeding program. He wrote the weight, the price, the premium, and the buyer's name. Then he wrote Roy Patton, Omaha, interested in more. That winter, he bred Frost to 8 cows. Now let me tell you about the years that tested everything, because the years that test everything are the ones that decide who was right and who was only lucky so far. 1973 and 74 arrived in Nebraska with the particular cruelty of back-to-back dry summers. The pastures along the Platte went thin and brown by July. Hay prices rose. Calvin watched his feed costs climb and his calf weights come in lower than he had projected, and he made the calculation that every small herd operator makes in a drought year: which animals to carry and which to sell early to reduce the load on the land. He sold 3 calves in August of 1973 that he had intended to hold until October. The price was lower for the early sale and the calves were lighter than they would have been. He netted $4,200 that year against costs of $3,100, leaving $1,100 of margin, enough to pay the property taxes and the veterinary bills, and put $300 aside. That was the whole of 1973. 1974 was not much better. Another dry summer, though not as severe. Calvin netted $3,800 against $2,900 in costs. He was surviving. He was not growing. He was fixing a section of fence on the south pasture in the August heat of 1974, sweating through his shirt when his father's voice came back to him the way it did in hard moments. Harold Reed had once told him during a dry summer in the late 1950s, when Calvin was still a boy, "A bad year tests the land. A harder year tests the man. What you find out in a hard year is whether you built something that lasts or something that only worked when everything was easy." Calvin drove the last fencing staple and moved to the next post. Frost was fine. That was the thing Calvin came back to when the numbers were discouraging. The bull was healthy and calm and working exactly as Doc Crane had said he would. The Simmental Cross calves, even in the drought years, were coming in with better feed conversion than the pure Herefords, which meant they were reaching market weight on less hay than Calvin would have needed for a full Hereford operation. The breed was doing what the performance data said it would do. The market was simply taking time to understand what it was looking at. Roy Patton called in the fall of 1974. He had a buyer in Kansas, a rancher named someone Calvin did not know, who was looking for Simmental cross breeding bulls. Not calves for slaughter, bulls with documentation. Roy asked if Calvin had anything worth showing. Calvin said he had been holding back one bull calf from the 1972 crop, now 2 years old, that he thought was the best animal he had produced. Roy said he would come look. Roy came in November, walked the pasture for an hour, and stood beside the 2-year-old bull with his hands in his pockets and his hat pushed back on his head. He asked for the animal's birth weight, weaning weight, an average daily gain since weaning. Calvin had all of it in the ledger. Roy read through the numbers twice. How much do you want for him? Calvin had thought about this. He said $1,800. Roy wrote the check on the hood of his truck. That was the first breeding bull Calvin Reed sold. He recorded it in the ledger that evening, November 1974. One Simmental Cross bull, 2 years old. Roy Patton, Omaha, $1,800. Then he wrote below it, because Harold Reed had always written things below the numbers that the numbers alone could not say, cost of producing this animal from Frost's first breeding season, estimated $420 in feed and veterinary care allocated to this calf specifically. Net on this animal, $1,380. He stared at that number for a while. Father's voice, flashback, came without him looking for it. Harold Reed sitting at this same desk in the winter of 1961, going over the year's accounts with Calvin standing beside him, 12 years old, and trying to understand what the columns meant. His father had said, a farming operation is not a business until it can reproduce itself. Selling calves for slaughter is selling your labor. Selling genetics is selling your thinking. There's a difference in what it's worth. Calvin closed the ledger and went to bed. Let me tell you about 1975 and 1976, because those are the years when the direction became undeniable. Roy Patton brought a buyer from Kansas in the spring of 1975, a rancher who drove 300 miles and spent 4 hours on Calvin's property before he shook hands on 2 Simmental Cross bulls at $2,000 each. The Kansas rancher walked the pasture and asked every question Calvin had answers to, and Calvin answered each one from the ledger, from the records, from the documentation that Harold Reed had taught him to keep, because paperwork is the farm's memory. Cost comparison, which Calvin was tracking carefully in the ledger by this point. Total investment in the Simmental program from March 1969 through the end of 1975. Five, including Frost purchase price, feed allocation, veterinary costs, and the 4 Hereford cows he had sold in 1969 to fund the early expenses, $4,340. Total revenue from Simmental Cross calves and breeding bulls over the same period, $6,120. He was ahead by $1,780, and he had Frost still producing and a growing set of documented cross animals in his herd. Harlan Speck had been quiet for some time. Not friendly, Harlan was never going to be friendly in the way that required admitting he had been wrong about something, but quiet. The public jokes had stopped sometime in 1972, after a man at the feed store had asked Harlan whatever happened to that French bull Calvin Reed bought, and Harlan had said, "It's Swiss, actually," and changed the subject, which was as close as Harlan Speck came to acknowledging that he had spoken without knowing what he was talking about. In the spring of 1976, Calvin saw Harlan's truck slow on the county road near the pasture where the Simmental crosses were grazing. The truck stopped. Harlan sat in the cab for a while looking at the animals. Then he drove on without turning in. Calvin watched from the barn. He did not go out to the road. He went back to what he was doing. In the fall of 1976, Roy Patton called again, and this time he said something that changed the shape of what Calvin was building. There's a premium registered Simmental sale in Lincoln next April. National buyers, not just regional people coming from Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Wyoming. Documented animals with traceable bloodlines are selling for $8,000 to $12,000 for proven bulls. Roy paused. Calvin, I've been buying cattle in this part of the country for 11 years. You have something here that most people don't know exists yet. You have first-generation Simmental cross animals with documentation going back to a registered Swiss import, and you have the records to prove every number. I think you should consign 2 bulls to that Lincoln sale. Calvin was quiet on the phone for a long moment. Roy said, "I know what you paid for Frost." Calvin said, "I'll think about it." He did not need to think about it for very long. Let me tell you about the 3rd Friday of April, 1977. Because that morning is the reason everything else in this story matters. Calvin and Dot left Plattsmouth at 4:45 in the morning. The truck loaded with 2 bulls in the trailer, Magnus, 4 years old, the finest animal Calvin had produced, a son of Frost, with documentation tracing back to the original Swiss import line, and a 3-year-old they had not yet named for the sale records, who was simply listed in the ledger by his ear tag number. Dot had made sandwiches and filled 2 thermoses the night before. She rode in the passenger seat without talking much, which was how she rode when she understood that the occasion called for quiet. The Nebraska landscape in April before sunrise is not particularly dramatic. The fields were still brown and gray from winter, the new growth not yet asserting itself. The sky, a flat dark above the headlights. Calvin drove the 140 miles to Lincoln with his hands easy on the wheel, and if he was thinking about the auction barn in Plattsmouth in 1969 and Harlan's spec standing up in the rows and the whole place laughing, he kept it to himself. The Nebraska State Fairgrounds came into view in the early morning light, and Calvin saw for the first time what a premium registered cattle sale looked like. The lot was nearly full by 7 in the morning. License plates from Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Wyoming, Iowa, Missouri. Trailers that cost more than Calvin's truck and the land beneath his barn combined. Men in better clothes than the Plattsmouth crowd carrying sale catalogs printed in 2 colors on heavy paper. Roy Patton found them inside and shook hands and walked with them to see the animals, and Calvin watched the buyers move through the pens with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this in several states and knew what numbers they were looking for. He looked down at his own hands, hay rough stained with work, the knuckles enlarged from years of cold mornings. He looked at Dot. She was reading the sale catalog. She had circled Magnus's entry in pen. Let me tell you about what happened next, because it is the reason people in Cass County were still talking about Calvin Reed a decade later. Magnus was lot 23. Calvin heard him before he saw him enter the ring. The sound came first, not the shuffling and scraping of a nervous animal, but something steadier. Each hoof placed with unhurried weight on the concrete approach, a rhythm that was slower and heavier than anything else that had moved through that ring all morning. The people in the front rows heard it too. A few of them turned. Then the ground carried it. Not a vibration exactly, but a presence, the way a large animal moving with confidence changes the air around it, makes the space feel occupied differently than it did a moment before. Then Magnus came into the ring. He was 1,450 pounds of pale gold, the color of winter grass in late afternoon light, with hindquarters built like the wall of a good barn square, deep solid in a way that had nothing to do with fat and everything to do with structure. His head was long and narrow and calm. He walked to the center of the ring and stood there, not pulling at the lead, not shifting his weight, just stood and looked at the crowd with the same patient dark eyes that Calvin had first seen in the Plattsmouth livestock barn 8 years ago on a different animal. Roy Patton leaned toward Calvin in the stands and said very quietly, "They're sitting up." He was right. Around the ring, men who had been leaning back in their seats or talking quietly to the person beside them had shifted forward. Not dramatically. Just the small repositioning that happens when something in front of you is worth looking at more carefully. The auctioneer opened at $4,000. $4,000. Who'll give me 4? The first hand went up before the sentence was finished. 4, I have 4. Who gives me 45? Another hand. 4,500. 5,000. 55. 6. 65. 7. The bidding moved the way good bidding moves, in a room full of serious buyers, not in the slow, uncertain steps of a barn where nobody is sure what they're looking at, but in clean, decisive increments from men who had come a long way and done their arithmetic before they arrived. Roy touched Calvin's arm at 7,500 and said nothing. Calvin watched the ring. 8,000. The man from Kansas raised his catalog. 10,000. The barn went a degree quieter. Not silent, the auctioneer's voice continued. The bid spotters called the machinery of the sale moved forward, but something had changed in the air. 10,000. Do I hear 11? Texas raised his hand. 11. 12 from Kansas. 13 from Texas. 14 from Kansas. $15,500 from Texas, and that was where it stopped. $15,500, ladies and gentlemen. Going once. Roy Patton was looking at Calvin. Calvin was looking at the ring. Magnus was still standing in the center of it, still calm, still occupying the space the way he had since he walked in. Going twice. The gavel came down. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the stands made a sound. The bid spotter near the Texas buyer lowered his arm. The auctioneer marked his sheet. One of the ring handlers reached for Magnus's lead rope. In those 3 seconds, the room held something that had no name, but that every person present recognized the particular stillness that follows when something has just happened that will be talked about later. Then the room came back. Not all at once, but in pieces. A voice here, a hand extended there, the sound of pens on paper and chairs shifting and then the sound of sustained applause from serious men who do not applaud often. Roy Patton turned to Calvin. He started to say something and stopped. He looked at his sale catalog, where Magnus's entry was circled in pen. He looked at Calvin. He looked at the catalog again. "Calvin, what did you pay for the Sire?" $85, Calvin said. Roy said nothing for a moment. He did not repeat the number as a question. He just sat with it the way you sit with a number that is technically something you already knew and still needs a moment to become real. $85 in 1969, Roy finally said. He was not talking to Calvin anymore. He was talking to the arithmetic. Calvin watched Magnus leave the ring. His 3-year-old bull was next. He opened his catalog to the right page, smoothed it with one rough hand, and waited. He did not smile. He did not look around to see who might be watching. He sat in the stands of the Nebraska State Fairgrounds with his hay-rough hands in his work-stained jacket and his wife beside him with her thermos of coffee, and he was as still and as quiet as Frost had been on the morning Calvin first brought him home. The stillness of an animal that had always known it was going to be fine and had simply waited for the rest of the world to catch up. The total for both bulls that afternoon was $26,800 against an $85 bull and 8 years of patient work. That evening, driving back down the highway toward Plattsmouth, Dot poured Calvin the last of the coffee from the second thermos and looked out at the darkening Nebraska sky and said, "Your father would have had something to say about this." Calvin drove. "What do you think he would have said?" Dot thought about it. She said, "Probably just that he told you so." Calvin almost smiled. His father had never said anything of the kind, but the feeling behind it was accurate, and that was enough. 2 days later, someone in Plattsmouth called the John Deere dealership and asked Harlan Speck if he had heard about the cattle sale up in Lincoln and whether he knew the farmer from out on the county road west of town who had sold 2 bulls for nearly $27,000 and whether he knew what that farmer had originally paid for the sire of those bulls. There was a pause on the line before Harlan answered. The person who made the call would later say that in all the years they had known Harlan Speck, they had never heard him sound quite like that. Not angry, not loud, just very, very still. Calvin Reed did not go looking for Harlan Speck. That was the thing people in Plattsmouth would remember later when the story had settled into the version that gets told at sale barns and feed stores and gets passed from one generation to the next until the specific details blur, but the shape of the thing remains. Calvin did not drive into town the week after the Lincoln sale and walk into Harlan's dealership and say anything at all. He went home, he did his chores, he fed his cattle, and he let the information travel on its own, the way information travels in small counties, which is faster and more thoroughly than anyone who has not lived in one would believe. It was 11 days after the Lincoln sale when Calvin next went into Plattsmouth. He needed a 50-pound sack of mineral supplement and a new float valve for the water tank in the East Pen. He went to the feed store, not the dealership, and he was standing at the counter, waiting for his order, when Harlan Speck came through the door. There were 2 other men in the store. Neither of them moved or pretended not to be paying attention, because in a town of this size, there was no protocol for pretending, and everyone understood that what was about to happen was the kind of thing that did not come along often and should be witnessed properly. Harlan looked at Calvin. Calvin looked at Harlan. Harlan was not the same size he had been in 1969. Not physically, he was still a large man, but in the way he occupied a room which had always been his particular talent and was now, for the first time Calvin could recall, working against him. He came to the counter and stood a few feet from Calvin and did not immediately say anything, which was so unlike Harlan Speck that the 2 men at the back of the store exchanged a glance. "I heard about Lincoln," Harlan said finally. Calvin nodded once. 26,000 and some. Harlan said the number, the way you say a number, you have been turning over in your head for a week and a half. For 2 bulls. That's right. Harlan was quiet again. The feed store held the particular silence of a room where everyone is breathing, but no one is willing to be the one who speaks next. A truck went past on the street outside. The refrigerator unit behind the counter hummed. "That bull you bought in '69, Harlan said. "Frost. Still alive." Calvin kept his voice level and even. 14 years old this spring. His sons are in herds across 4 states. Harlan nodded slowly, looking at the counter between them rather than at Calvin. He put one large hand flat on the wooden surface the way a man does when he needs something solid to stand on. I stood up in that auction barn, he said, in front of everyone. You did. I told you to dig a grave. You did. Another silence. Harlan's jaw moved slightly, the way it does when a person is putting words together and rejecting them before they reach the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than Calvin had ever heard it, stripped of the carrying quality that Harlan had always used, the way other men use a handshake, to establish that he was present and had opinions and expected to be taken seriously. I was wrong, Calvin. I said it in front of the whole county, and I was wrong about every word of it. The animal, the breed, the investment, all of it. I was showing off, and I was wrong. Calvin looked at him for a moment. He picked up the float valve from the counter where the clerk had set it and turned it once in his hands. He was not a man given to speeches, and he did not make one now. He said what needed to be said in the way that things need to be said when they have been waiting 8 years to be said properly. Harlan, he said, you weren't wrong because you didn't know about Simmental. You were wrong because you were certain about something you didn't know. He said it quietly and without heat, the way you state a measurement or a fact from a ledger, not as an accusation, but as the accurate description of what had happened. Then he took a sack of mineral supplement off the counter, picked up the float valve, and walked out to his truck. The two men at the back of the store did not say anything until after Calvin's engine had started and his tires had moved on the gravel. Then one of them said to no one in particular, "That's the whole of it right there. Let me tell you about the farm crisis, because without understanding what happened to Nebraska agriculture between 1980 and 1986, you cannot fully understand what the next chapter of this story meant." The late 1970s had been good years for American farmers, commodity prices rising, land values climbing, and the banks in every county encouraging farmers to borrow against that rising land value and expand. The advice seemed sound at the time. It usually does. Then in 1979, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates to break inflation, and what had been a 7% operating loan became a 15% operating loan, and then a 19% operating loan by 1981. Land values that had been climbing stopped and reversed. Corn and soybean prices fell. Farmers who had borrowed $200,000 against land valued at $2,000 an acre found themselves holding land now worth $800 an acre, and loans the income could not service. First Farmers Bank of Plattsmouth, where Dale Fitch had sat in the auction barn in 1969 and told Calvin he was lighting money on fire, called in 3 operating loans in the fall of 1982 and began foreclosure proceedings on 2 farms in Cass County the following spring. By 1985, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation had placed First Farmers Bank into receivership. The building on Main Street in Plattsmouth that had carried Dale Fitch's name on the letterhead for 21 years became within 2 years a law office. Calvin Reed carried no operating debt. He had expanded the Simmental program by purchasing 40 additional acres from a neighbor in 1980 cash, at a time when cash buyers were rare enough that the price was favorable, and he had never borrowed against his land value in the boom years, because Harold Reed's voice was too clear in his memory, and Harold Reed had never borrowed against land value in his life. Vernon Holt, who had stopped at Calvin's fence line in 1971 to ask about the pale calves and gone away, shaking his head, lost 80 acres in a forced sale in the spring of 1983. Calvin attended the auction. He bought 30 of those 80 acres at $180 per acre, which was what the bank would take and what the market would bear that day. He wrote the check without conversation and went home. He was not cruel about it. He did not mention it to Vernon afterward, and Vernon, to his credit, did not bring it up either. Some things between neighbors are understood without being discussed. Frost died in the autumn of 1983. He was 14 years old, and he went the way good animals go when they have lived correctly, not from disease or injury, but from the simple completion of a life that had been spent doing exactly what it was built to do. Calvin found him on a Tuesday morning in October, lying in the east pasture in the spot he had always preferred, near the fence line, where the ground was slightly higher and the drainage was good. He was already gone. Calvin stood beside him for a long time without doing anything else. His father's voice came to him then, and it came clearly, the way it did in moments that mattered. A good animal doesn't need a headstone. The work it did is its name. Frost had left behind 31 direct offspring in Calvin's herd. 87 animals in herds across Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, and Wyoming traced their bloodlines directly to the $85 bull from the Plattsmouth livestock barn. The American Simmental Association's records, which Calvin had maintained with the same ledger discipline his father had taught him, documented every one of them. Calvin buried Frost in the corner of the east pasture near the fence post where the bull had spent his first nights in 1969. He did not mark the grave with anything elaborate. He set a field stone at the head of it, the kind of stone that comes up in Nebraska soil every spring as reliably as the grass, and he went back to work. Let me tell you about the years that followed Frost's death, because they are the years when what Calvin Reed had built stopped being a private achievement and started being something the county had to reckon with. By 1985, the Reed Simmental program carried 68 registered animals. That spring, at a Nebraska State Fair registered cattle sale in Lincoln, the same fairgrounds, the same ring of Son of Magnus sold for $18,000 to a rancher from Wyoming who had driven 600 miles specifically to bid on animals from the Reed bloodline. The Plattsmouth Courier ran a short piece. The headline did not say anything about 1969 or about $85 or about Harlan Speck and a shovel. It said simply, Cass County breeder achieves premium price at Lincoln sale. Calvin read it at the kitchen table, folded the paper, and went out to check on the herd. Dot cut it out and kept it in the drawer where she kept things worth keeping. By 1987, Calvin and Dot Reed held 200 acres free and clear. Not 200 acres with a mortgage they were working against. 200 acres with no lien of any kind, which in Nebraska in 1987, after 6 years of agricultural crisis, was a condition so rare that the county extension agent mentioned it by way of example when he gave talks to young farmers about debt management. He did not use Calvin's name without asking. Calvin said he could use it if he thought it would help someone. In the years between 1979 and 1987, Calvin sold or provided bull semen on extended credit to 14 small operations in the county that were struggling to maintain their herds through the crisis years. He did not advertise this. He set his prices for the distressed operations at whatever they could pay at the time, with the balance due when things improved. Several of them paid him years later. 2 of them never fully could, and Calvin did not pursue it. Roy Patton, who had been buying from Calvin for 16 years by this point, said once over coffee at the Reed kitchen table that he had never met a man who was harder to do a favor for or easier to do business with, and that in his experience those 2 qualities almost never appeared in the same person. Dot refilled his coffee and said Calvin had learned both from his father, which was accurate, and Roy said he wished more people had. Let me tell you about the summer of 1987, because that is when Harlan Speck came to the farm for the first time. He drove in on a Thursday afternoon in July alone in a truck that was not the large new model he had always driven during the dealership years. It was a used half-ton, recently cleaned but showing its age. Calvin was in the barn working on a gate mechanism that had been sticking since April and had finally decided to address it properly. He heard the truck come up the lane and went to the barn door and looked out. Harlan got out slowly, the way men in their mid-60s get out of trucks, taking stock of what the movement is going to cost before committing to it. He stood by the truck for a moment and looked at the property. The Simmental herd was visible in the east pasture, the descendants of an $85 bull, now worth more per animal than some operations in the county were worth entire. Calvin walked out to meet him. Harlan was carrying something, a piece of folded newsprint, yellowed and soft at the creases, the kind of paper that has been handled many times and kept somewhere dry. He held it out and Calvin took it. It was a page from the Plattsmouth Courier dated April 1969. A brief item on page 8 about the spring livestock sale at the Cass County barn. 2 sentences about a local farmer purchasing an unusual European breed animal at below market price. Calvin's name was in it. He had never seen this clipping. He had not known it existed. "I cut that out the week of the sale," Harlan said. His voice was the quietest Calvin had heard it in 38 years of knowing the man. "I kept it because I wanted to have proof when the animal died. I wanted to be able to show it to people and say I told him so right there in the paper." He stopped. A meadowlark called from the fence line. The herd in the east pasture moved slowly in the afternoon light. "I've been carrying it for 18 years, Harlan said. "It didn't turn out to be proof of what I thought it was going to be proof of." Calvin looked at the clipping. He looked at the date. He thought about the man who had stood up in the auction barn in this month of this year and made the whole of Cass County laugh. He thought about the 8 years of silence on the county road. He thought about the feed store and the float valve and what he had said and whether it had been enough or too much or exactly right. He handed the clipping back. "Keep it," Calvin said. "It reminds you of something worth remembering." Harlan took it. He folded it carefully along the old creases and put it in his shirt pocket. The dealership had been closed for a year by then, sold to a regional equipment chain that had eventually rebranded it and moved the inventory to a larger lot outside of town. 22 years of Harlan Speck's working life gone into someone else's balance sheet. "I don't know what I expected when I came out here," Harlan said. Calvin thought about that. "You expected to find out whether it was too late to say the right thing." Harlan looked at him. "Is it?" Calvin considered the east pasture, the herd, the fieldstone in the corner of the fence line that marked a spot most people would not know to look for. He thought about Harold Reed, who had taught him that patience was not the absence of action, but a form of action in itself, the hardest kind, the kind that required you to be right about something for years before anyone else could see it. "No," he said. "It's not too late," he paused, "but it was a long time coming." Harlan nodded. He stood for another moment by the truck. Then he got in and drove back down the lane, and Calvin watched him go, and then went back into the barn and finished fixing the gate. Let me tell you the last thing, because it is what Calvin Reed would have wanted you to take from all of this. Calvin farmed that land until he was 74 years old, and then he passed the operation to his son Raymond, who had been working beside him for the better part of 2 decades. Raymond Reed was not his father. He was louder, more inclined to attend meetings and give opinions, less comfortable with long silences. But he had learned the ledger discipline and the patience for good genetics, and the particular Reed quality of being willing to be underestimated. In the spring of 2003, at a registered Simmental sale in Omaha, Raymond consigned a bull that traced its lineage directly to Frost through Magnus, through 2 more generations of careful selection. The animal sold for $22,000. Afterward, a young farmer from Saunders County who had watched the sale came and found Raymond and asked him how his family had gotten into Simmental breeding and what they had paid for their original sire. Raymond told him. The young farmer's expression went through the same sequence that Roy Patton's had gone through in Lincoln in 1977. The same arithmetic disbelief, the same need to hear the number, twice the same slow understanding of what it meant. He said, "My grandfather always told me the best deals look like mistakes to everyone else." Raymond said mine said something similar. Calvin Reed died in September of 2009. He was 86 years old. The funeral was held at the Methodist Church in Plattsmouth, and the parking lot was full an hour before the service, and people stood along the walls inside because there were no seats left. Farmers came from Kansas and Iowa and Wyoming, men who had bought bulls from Calvin or whose fathers had men who had received credit extensions in 1982 and 1983 and had eventually paid them back and wanted to say so in person. Doc Elbert Crane had died in 1991, but his son, who practiced veterinary medicine in the same county, was there. Roy Patton drove up from Omaha at 81 years old and sat in the third row. Harlan Speck did not attend. He had died in 2001, and if Calvin had any feelings about the order in which things happened, he had kept them in the place he kept most things in the ledger of the mind, noted and filed, not requiring public statement. Raymond spoke at the service. He said his father had taught him 3 things worth passing on, and he said them plainly because Calvin Reed had never been a man for ornamentation. The first was that paperwork is the farm's memory, so keep it like it matters. The second was that the man who moves first when he is uncertain usually loses, and the man who waits until he is certain usually wins, but the rarest man is the one who knows the difference. The third was this: do not laugh at what you do not understand, and do not trust the certainty of a man who has never had to pay for being wrong. The Reed Simmental program is still operating on the same 160 acres west of Plattsmouth, where Harold Reed farmed without debt and Calvin Reed bought an $85 bull that the whole county said would not see summer. Raymond's daughter Ellen took over partial management in 2015. She is the 3rd generation of Reed cattle farmers, and she keeps the ledgers the same way her grandfather kept them by hand, in the same type of bound notebook Harold Reed used, with the numbers on one side and the things the numbers cannot say on the other. In the barn office, on a shelf above the breeding records, there is a piece of folded newsprint in a small frame. It is yellowed and soft at the creases from years of handling. It is the Plattsmouth Courier, April 1969, page 8, two sentences about a local farmer and a European breed animal. It was found among Harlan Speck's personal effects after his death and sent to the Reed farm by Harlan's daughter, who had been told by her father that it belonged there. Below it in Calvin's handwriting on a piece of lined notebook paper are two lines that Raymond had framed alongside the clipping after his father died. They read, "The shovel was never needed. The ground held something worth keeping." If this story stayed with you, drop a one in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. And if you know someone who's being told that the old way is the wrong way, or that what they're building isn't worth the trouble, share this with them. For more stories about American farmers who held on when holding on was the hardest thing they could do, subscribe and stay with us. There are more of these stories, and they all deserve to be told.